right, Sterile Processing Universe, welcome to a brand new Beyond Clean podcast series titled Sterile Horizons, Advancing ASC Excellence, sponsored by Solventum. I'm your host, Bobby Parker, and in this series, our aim is to detail both the challenges and opportunities for instrument reprocessing in the ASC so that you can provide the best quality of care for your patients, every instrument, every time. On this opening episode, we've titled it Lean ASC, Designing for Efficiency and Safety. And we'll be taking a hard look at the lean manufacturing model, that quality system that is used in other industries, originated primarily in the auto industry, and trying to help us apply some of those principles to the ASC environment, particularly the sterile processing department, and how that might be able to help us overcome some of the challenges that we have with limited resources or limited space. Now, to help us do that, we've invited a giant from the sterile processing education space, David Jagrosse, with his decades of experience, both from a technician all the way up through department manager and consultant, to share with us some of his wisdom about how to apply some of these tools to help our departments function both efficiently but also safely with a high degree of quality. I think it's going to be an excellent interview. If you've spent any time talking to Dave, you know this is going to be a fun one. So we will be right back after a quick break. And joining us now in studio is Dave Jagrosse, president of David Jagrosse Consulting. Dave, welcome back to the show. We've talked to you a couple of times, but always good to hear your voice. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Bobby. I'm always very thankful to be able to present on the podcast.
Well, the honor is certainly all of ours. You always have some great insight. We like to have a little bit of fun as we talk as well. So looking forward to this conversation. Dave, the topic at hand today is around ambulatory surgery centers, those ASCs. We're going to be talking specifically about the challenges in those ASCs, and for the scope of our conversation, looking at, how do you make it work in such a small environment and using some lean principles. But maybe before we dive into the meat of this, could you get us started with just a quick definition of what is an ASC? Like, what does that mean to you, and what might it mean out in the sterile processing world?
Sure. I mean, you're going to see that term. I see that term more often than not, ASC, Ambulatory Surgical Center. Some places just call them their surgical center, their offsite. Some of them are part of the larger health system, part of the hospital. Some of them are standalone and operated by the doctors themselves, but it's essentially a smaller offsite, typically same day type of surgery where patients will not stay overnight at these types of facilities.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And that's a good introduction and appetizer for what that might look like in the coming episodes on this series. We plan to take a deeper dive into kind of how they function, both from a financial perspective and from a structural and design perspective. So if you're catching this episode far into the future, go look at the full series and catch the deep dive on ASCs. But today we're going to be looking at how to survive in that environment using a tool that we like to refer to as lean. So that's what we're going to dive into today, Dave. So let's carry the definitions on what is lean. Like, what does that mean in the context of sterile processing?
Sure. I mean, lean is a management tool that we use. You may hear other definitions like Six Sigma, but it really derives out of, back in the old days, we called it total quality management, but it's a skill set. It's a way to apply certain principles to the work that you do to not only produce a quality outcome, but to try to eliminate the defects that might happen along the way.
Total quality management. So that's a new one for me as well. How long ago was that?
That's a new old one.
It's a new old one. Okay, yeah, perfect. So it is a unique way of looking at manufacturing. That lean concept came from the Toyota manufacturing model as they're producing cars. So kind of thinking along the lines of assembly line work, which doesn't exactly translate to sterile processing. We're not an assembly line per se, but those commitments and those beliefs about how we're going to manage human motion and try to protect those things and how we're going to manage quality, there's a tremendous amount of value that we can bring into managing sterile processing. Interestingly enough, there is a Toyota motor manufacturing plant in Kentucky within driving distance of where I'm at in Louisville. And so when we would get brand new supervisors, one of the things that we did for kind of a fun field trip was to drive out to Georgetown, Kentucky, and get on the little golf cart that they drive you through the facility and see see some of those principles in play. I don't know that it necessarily revolutionized the way that we led our sterile processing department, but just trying to get people to catch the vision for this lean bug. So one of the biggest areas of opportunities, I guess, for those commitments, particularly related to lean, is dealing with waste. Anything in the process that doesn't add value to these instruments and figuring out how to get rid of them. So let's spend a little bit of time looking at that commitment, the ruthless elimination of waste in our process. What kinds of waste should we be looking for in sterile processing and maybe even particularly in the ASC?
Yeah, and I think it's important to point out two things is that manufacturing concept is a great concept. I know Hank gets a little touchy with it when we try to just say this is, like you have to keep the people in as part of the process, but conceptualizing it that way, I used to talk to my staff that way to say, look, the case cart, if you're doing a full case cart system, the case cart is like the car and the instrument set that you're putting together is like the engine. And we have to put all these components together in a quality, safe way. And these principles really do help and apply. And then you carve out an ASC, it's smaller by design. Unfortunately, a lot of times they're not designed properly because they were maybe designed to do more general surgery. And now we see more orthopedics heading out into these ASCs. So as we all know, or maybe not know in the sterile processing world, a orthopedic case is going to put a lot more bigger, heavier trays in play. So how do we sort of fit the square peg into the round hole, right? Lean looks at 8 types of waste, and one of them being, we'll go through them bullet by bullet and try to apply them to sterile processing specifically. So, of course, there's transportation, right? An example of that is looking at the way trays are being moved either from your main campus, maybe you're borrowing trays that day for the surgery, or we all know that we have loaner trays. Now, one example of a problem in an ASC is there's no vendor drop off and pickup area because typically you're working in one room. You're lucky in a lot of instances if you actually have a separate decontam room from a separate assembly and processing area. So, one thing to look at is transportation, either from the facility or with that vendor. Your inventory, again, why are you borrowing? We don't have a lot of storage in an ASC, so we are relying on those loaner trays to come in for the Monday case and then go away until we need them again, maybe on Friday. Same thing with the main hospital. Ocean, you touched on this, Bobby. There isn't a lot of space in a ASC sterile processing, so every step is valuable. Every part of the motion, where you're walking, where you're going in, where you're processing the instruments, really makes a big, big difference. Waiting, right? That's another bullet. Another thing is like you're waiting on trays, you're waiting on those loaner trays to come in, or a lot of times ambulatory centers turn items over. So the 7 a.m. equipment, we wait for the room to break, and then we're processing it, we're cleaning it, and then we're trying to turn that over for, let's say, the 3 p.m. case. Now, earlier, you asked me what lean meant, and that's sort of doing more with less, but I like to say less. It's not doing more with less, it's bringing more value with less waste. But what lean isn't, is cutting corners by any means.
I'm glad you said that, because when you talked about Hank's kind of hobby horse of this topic, and kind of the line from an article that he wrote is titled "A Worker, Not a Widget," and like treating sterile processing as individuals and not as production things is very important for us to get our arms around. And so
Absolutely.
the spirit of this episode is not how do we make our sterile processing department more efficient so that we can get by with fewer workers. It's more like dealing with the tremendous challenge in the ASC environment that's getting overrun by these orthopedic cases with one sterile processing tech. And if we're not wildly efficient with that one or two technicians that we have, we're going to have to choose to cut some corners to get the case done, or the case just isn't going to happen. But if we can bring more value with less waste, we could actually achieve that. So thanks for that call.
No, that really describes, and I get why, Hank, that is a problem with lean in general. But if later on in our discussion, if we talk about how it succeeds and fails, one of the major reasons or ways that it can fail is not involving that front line staff. They are the experts. They have the answers. They know how it works. So lean talks about the first thing you do is going to do a go see. You go and see how the work is actually done. So that's very critical. That's a critical portion of it. If I continue with the 8 wastes, another one is over processing. And in the instance of an ASC, this is really critical. And I think I've actually done some spots with you guys in regards to, let's just say that the loaner trays come in or the hospital trays come over. There's 8 of them. Is the doctor really going to use all 8 pans? Because now we're over processing. They're going to open all of those trays. Now, what we didn't mention, and we should, is that some of these ASCs don't have mechanical washers, believe it or not, or they have under counter dishwasher style washers, mechanical washers. So, you really could put a burden on these facilities by, I might only be able to fit 3 trays in that washer that I have there. So now efficiency matters, and you don't want to over process. Some ways around that is to work with the vendor and determine what trays are really actually going to be used. You can develop like an open and hold. Like open means they open them in the room, but hold means they're outside the room. And then they could come back to SPD sterile. So you see how we're sort of we're not over processing trays we didn't use. Another tool out there is there are companies that will come in and they have validated methods or means of reconfiguring those trays so that the 8 trays go into 4 trays. And I think we've done some podcasts specifically on that company and on that product. Overproduction, that could fit in the same category. Like if I'm reprocessing 8 trays and I only use 3 of them, that's overproduction. Defects is huge. We want to reduce defects. Again, a lot of loaner trays are wrapped in blue wrap. And by default, we're going to see holes and tears, and that really sets us back. Missing instruments, all the common defects that we see in a sterile processing. The more that we reduce that, obviously the leaner and more efficient we're going to be, along with being safe.
Yeah, and from a waste perspective, the complaint, I don't have time to do the quality inspection on these instruments. Well, if that is true, you certainly aren't going to have time to do the tray a second time whenever we discover there was a defect in it. So that rework that comes along with not doing quality work is just wasted efficiency, wasted production.
And it's key in the ASC because at the main hospital, we have 3 of these setups, but we only sent 1 setup to the ASC. So it's sort of do or die, right? If I make a mistake or it's unsterile, we got to wake the patient up. And then the final bullet, and I think it's important to mention, was we touched on it, underutilized talent, not engaging those frontline techs and problem solving and improvement efforts. Number one, you're never going to get buy-in. But number 2, like I said, Edward Deming is the godfather of quality systems. He's the one who actually went to Japan after the war and started the whole total quality movement, which then evolved into Six Sigma and Lean. But he used to say, how do you expect someone to do a job if you don't explain what that job is? So engaging that frontline staff is critical because they do hold a lot of the answers.
Yeah, thanks for running through that list. What I don't want is for people's, heads to be spinning or minds reeling and thinking about I've got a lot to learn. In many ways, eliminating waste is just a commitment to look for what are the things that we're doing with these instruments that don't get them any closer to being a sterile product delivered on time to the OR. So just to kind of run a couple of them through that filter, you mentioned transportation. If you're in a really large facility and your sterile processing department is, say across a pedway in the building across the way, all of that time and money that you're spending, paying people to push the carts across the hallway, it's kind of like you're paying rent. Like your department runs at a higher cost because of its distance from the OR. It's just a nature of it. And so as we think through like all the things that we have to move in our process in order to get it, through the cleaning process, follow the IFUs, get it sterile, get it back to the OR. If we can reduce the things that don't add value, like extra movement, extra steps from the technician, extra transportation, extra motion, then that's going to buy time for our technicians to focus on what really matters, which is the quality inspection of the instrument and following the IFU steps, rather than sacrificing those to do these other necessary but wasteful things that work with our process.
And Bobby, there is, as a reminder, the new AAMI, AAMI TIR, which is a technical information report, TIR 109, that covers the transportation of clean, dirty, sterile instruments. So we have guidance, a little more detailed guidance on that now.
That's a great call out. All right. Well, I want to make sure that leaders and frontline technicians who are listening to this episode of the application of lean to sterile processing have some tools that they could walk away with besides just kind of putting on the waste glasses and think, what things are we doing that's not adding value, so that they could get some quick wins in their department. So maybe let's go there next. What are some lean tools that could help a sterile processing leader get some quick wins on making their department more efficient?
Sure. I mean, the actual tools we use is Lean uses what's called 5S. It's a sequence of words: sort, set in order, shine, standardize, and sustain. So it's just a way to analyze the process in a real orderly way so that you can analyze it and then find out where the waste is and then make the changes.
I love that. I've done a 5S project on a workstation in our department to try to get some clutter out of the way and make it work. But I tell you, it was not as effective as Jenny Gibbs' project was. If you follow the Beyond Clean podcast in a previous season, the one on or the season that we did on Planet Assembly, all around prep and pack, Jenny gave a fantastic interview about how she took her kind of 1980s flat top stainless table, and they went through a replacement project where they got ergonomic ones that were better for the staff's health. But then also they were intentional about how they set that up so that you don't find the newspapers and Coke bottles in the pullout drawer,
Absolutely.
And those things. But how do we arrange the items on the table so that everything on every station looks exactly the same? People know where to find things. They're in stock, and it's not the stereotypical, you find a different set of supplies on every workstation and people are running around
Exactly.
saying, where is the insulation tester? And, all the things that waste time in the department. Sometimes like that first step of getting the stuff out of the way and making a standard spot for everything can really pave the way for you to start having good conversations about being efficient with your time, because a cluttered mess is a problem when you're trying to move efficiently.
It is. And that's a real good takeaway for the audience, is looking at that assembly table, standardizing it. If you put an open bin, you're going to end up with things in it. You have to dust these areas. They can't just be open bins. They collect dust. So you have a lot going on the assembly tables. And one of the things that it led me to was to develop a three-tier tackle box system. We have these tackle boxes, plastic tackle boxes. They're almost like for crafts, and you open them up and we have all of our supplies in there, and we would issue those to each technician. This way the tables were clear. These tackle boxes were over on a cart with your name on them, and you kind of owned it. You owned it and you had to resupply your tackle box. Yeah. So just as an idea of that efficiency, and you need the tools to do your job. I'm a big believer in checklists, and a natural outcome of a lot of this is developing a checklist. Before I go into decontam, do I have the tools to do the job? Before I assemble, do I have the tools to do the job? Because you don't want to be on step 22 of an IFU and realize you need gauze or you need a towel, and then that breaks your workflow. And that's when defects occur. I go and get the gauze and I come back and thought I was on step 25, right? So it's really those types of things to focus on. The little wins can equal big wins, you know?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And that's the temptation in sterile processing is if you're running a department that's, you know, perennially 100 trays behind at 7 a.m., it can feel like we don't have the time to be making any of these small improvements, but it is so much of a numbers game. Like if you pick maybe the top 10 trays that you process from a volume perspective, and you were to remove a couple of unneeded instruments just from those 10 trays, you process them so often that it accounts for such a large part of your volume that you get a tremendous payout with pretty minimal effort. So if you can go after the things that really matter and make small adjustments, you're right, it does end up becoming part of a really big win.
And Bobby, I'm glad that's a great segue into what they call PDSA. That's how you basically implement this project. You plan, you do it, you study it, and then you act on it. Because what occurs is, I call it drift. We might come out with a new process. Okay, we organize the tables. Guys, this is the table. This is what we're going to have on it, and this is how it works. Well, if we don't study and act on that in real time, we get what I call drift. We slowly drift away from what we implemented unless it's under sort of continuous quality improvement, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah,
that
that's well
really
said.
applies to a lot of things in the department.
We're throwing out a lot of language that's making all the Lean and Six Sigma people real happy. I hope that this is enough to whet the appetite to go study. There's plenty of free resources online about how to use some of these tools, but you're right, that PDSA cycle of implementation is real important. Dave, at the beginning of the talk, you said that you had some thoughts around the difference between why some projects succeed, others maybe fail. And certainly that implementation piece of it is a part of it. But I think I'd like to wrap up our conversation by giving you the last word here around that category. If you're trying to make an improvement in your department, whether that's, changing the order of what you use each sink bay for, or to your point, just reorganizing the tables, what's the difference between a project that you think is going to succeed and one that is most likely going to drift right back to where you started?
Yeah, sure. Let's talk about where the success comes from first. And that, like we said, we'll put that on the top of the pecking order, is that engaging the people that do the work. Because once you do that, you're pretty much going to choose a problem that really matters most to that team, and you're going to get the most buy-in on it. Now, of course, as the director, like I would do team huddles and I'd say, what are your top issues? They'd say parking, right? Now, so, you got to kind of weed that out. All right. That's a separate conversation, but let's talk about, you got to narrow it into the processing stream and starting small. We're not going to solve the world's problems. We're not going to take on the biggest one. We want to implement something small and then have that build momentum. And when we see that success, we'll get that buy-in from the teams, and they'll say, hey, if we do this, it really does work. And you want to be able to measure it. You don't want to just say it feels better, it looks better, it seems better. We want to do something that's measurable, and that measuring that goes towards your quality measures. You want to report these successes to the people above you. Again, failure comes from not involving the frontline team, sort of the top down, like this is what we're going to do. This is what Dave's implementing. It's just not going to go over well. And I think you touched on it, Bobby, focusing on speed over quality. And I know that's always a very hot button when we bring it up online, right? But I always say this, if my expectation of you is 0, when you do 1, you've exceeded my expectation, right? So in anything we do, we have to have some kind of benchmark. If you have a tracking system, you'll know how many trays on average people do, things of that nature. But it isn't about speed, but we are a department that needs to turn things over, and we can't just put the sets together nonchalantly, right? So there has to be balance. And then that follow-up, Bobby, that measuring it, the plan, do, study, act is really important, because we don't want what I call that drift. We don't want to have like real success the first month and then it just trickles off into nowhere, right? So those are some of the wins and ways you could win. In some ways it won't be so successful.
Yeah, that's really helpful and really important for our sterile processing departments in trying to make improvements out there. You know, some of the things that you were describing in successful and unsuccessful lean projects brought to mind some of those visits through the Toyota plant. The story that they love to tell is about this frontline worker who had to climb into the car as it was going down the assembly line and install some of the interior panels. And it was physically straining. It was slow. Nobody liked that job. But the guy was also, I believe, a bass fisherman. He had this kind of swiveling fisherman's chair on his boat. He was like, if I had one of these swivelly chairs where I could just like fly into the car, do my thing and scoot back out, it would be amazing. So he brought this in, talked with head leadership about it, kind of mocked up a prototype. They did that kind of planning. They did a small scale doing. They studied the results of it. It was wildly successful. So they acted. They implemented it everywhere. And that is one of their favorite stories of how one of these process improvements that saved ergonomics, it helped their quality, it certainly helped their efficiency, and it came from the front lines and really made everybody's lives better. So
Sure.
Yeah, those projects that succeed start with the front lines. They're ones that people are on board with. They're ones that have been carefully thought out and tested on a small scale and then applied at a large scale and audited for their success to make sure that they don't drift. All right. Well, Dave, excellent interview and introduction to lean. I hope everybody has been maybe not thoroughly indoctrinated, but at least caught the lean bug to explore this further in their departments. If somebody wanted to talk further with you about lean projects and sterile processing, what would be the best way for them to get in touch with you?
The best way would be through my email, David Jagrosse at gmail.com. I'm pretty responsive on there.
Love that. Well, we'll be sure to include that in the description so that folks can get in touch with you. Dave, thanks again for joining the show. Great interview.
Thank you, Bobby.
And that was Dave Jagrosse, president of Dave Jagrosse Consulting, sharing with us his thoughts around translating lean manufacturing principles to the sterile processing department. You know, we titled this episode Lean ASC, Designing for Efficiency and Safety. And I'd say primarily we talked about efficiency and production in the episode, but I do want to underline and call out what Dave said from a safety perspective as well, because often creating a lean process that is one that has been optimized to reduce waste, one that is been 5S'd, meaning it's been set in order in a way that it's got standard locations, it's fully stocked, can really have an impact on the quality output of the department. Dave gave the example of leaving a count sheet in the middle of building the tray to go get a supply and coming back and trying to find your place and maybe skipping a line that could produce a defect and end up causing a problem for our customers in the OR. A lot of practical takeaways from this one. Certainly, we introduced a lot of concepts which may be brand new to you, but looking at your processes from that filter of how can we reduce the amount of unnecessary work that we're doing, whether that's transportation or human motion or even overproduction, like looking at the loaners, as Dave had said, and trying to figure out which of these instruments do we actually use and figuring out how we can reconfigure those, or which of these trays get opened in the OR, and cleaning up our count sheets such that it's very clear to those working the room which ones need to be opened and which ones stay on hold and are maybe reserved and sent back sterile instead of opened and reprocessed. Those kinds of impacts are important in any sterile processing department, but certainly in an environment like an ASC where staffing might be more of a challenge in terms of just availability and getting through all the work. Well, I hope that you've enjoyed this introduction to ASC reprocessing. We've got many more episodes coming on this series around ASCs, so stay tuned. That's going to do it for this week's episode of Sterile Horizons. Until we talk to you again next time here on the show, keep fighting dirty.